The night Vivian Mercer's world collapsed, she wasn't running from a man who hated her. She was running from a man who loved her, and still pulled the trigger anyway. She had seen it with her own eyes. Through the crack of a half-open door, in a room that smelled of cigarette smoke and expensive leather, she watched the man she planned to spend her life with raise a gun to another man's temple. No hesitation, no remorse. Just Luca Moretti, the man who kissed her forehead every morning and remembered how she took her coffee, ending a human life with the same calm he used to sign business contracts. She never made a sound. She backed away from that door, walked down 17 floors of marble staircase because she was too afraid to wait for the elevator, and stepped out into a Chicago night that felt like it had swallowed all the oxygen in the world. She was 4 months pregnant. She never went back. If you've ever loved someone who turned out to be a stranger, if you've ever had to choose between your heart and your survival, you already know what Vivian felt that night. And if you haven't, pray you never do. This is her story. If it moves you, hits you somewhere real, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, and if you're new here, subscribe and stay close. The stories we tell on this channel don't let go easily. Now, let's begin. The night started like most Thursday nights in Vivian's life at that point. Unremarkable, almost domestic in a way that still felt slightly borrowed, slightly too good to be true. She had her own key to Luca's building, not the front entrance that the security team monitored, but the private elevator that opened directly into his upper floor corridor, the one reserved for family. He'd given it to her 3 months into their relationship, pressing it into her palm on a Tuesday morning without ceremony, without a speech, just a quiet look that said more than most men managed in years of talking. She wasn't supposed to be there that evening. They'd made plans for Friday, but the restaurant she worked at had closed early, a busted pipe in the kitchen, and she'd found herself with 2 free hours and a specific craving for his bad habit of ordering too much Thai food and watching old boxing footage on mute while they talked about everything and nothing. She hadn't called ahead. That was the detail that changed everything. The private elevator opened onto the 41st floor at 9:47 p.m. She knew the time because she'd glanced at her phone while stepping out, thinking she'd text him from the hallway so he'd hear her coming. She was already smiling. She was already thinking about whether she wanted spring rolls or dumplings. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet, actually. She noticed that in a detached way, the kind of noticing you only remember afterward when you're trying to reconstruct the exact sequence of your own undoing. His office door was slightly open. Not wide. Maybe 6 inches. Enough for light to cut across the hallway floor in a thin gold strip. She heard voices. 2 men, low and controlled. Low. The tone wasn't angry. That was the thing that slowed her feet more than anything. Anger, she could have explained. Anger she might have backed away from and given him space for. But what she heard was something colder, administrative. The voice of a man explaining something that had already been decided. Luca's voice. She stopped 3 feet from the door. Her hand was already up, ready to knock, frozen in the air. "You understood the arrangement," Luca said. Quiet. Not a shout. Not a threat. Just a statement of fact the way a weather report is a statement of fact. "You understood it from the beginning." Another voice, this one rougher, thinner, a man trying to hold himself together. "I can explain the—" "You don't need to explain anything to me." Silence. Then a sound she would spend the next 6 years trying to unhear. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She stood in that hallway with her hands still raised and her brain doing that thing it does sometimes when information arrives that it simply refuses to file, circling it, stepping around it, refusing to open the package. When she finally made herself look through the gap in the door, the man on the floor was already still. Luca was standing with his back partially toward her, and one of his men, a quiet, broad-shouldered man she'd met twice and whose name she'd never been told, was already moving forward with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and would do it again and had long since stopped feeling anything about it. Luca turned slightly to say something to his man, and that's when she saw his face. He didn't look monstrous. That was the part she couldn't reconcile, even years later. He looked the way he looked when he was finishing a difficult phone call. Tired. Resolved. A little removed. Like he'd just closed a tab on his computer. She backed away from the door. 1 step, 2 steps. Her heel caught the edge of the hallway runner and she stumbled slightly but didn't fall, catching herself against the wall with one palm flat against the plaster. She made it back to the private elevator. She pressed the button. She waited 9 seconds. She counted them. And when the doors opened, she stepped inside and watched the gold strip of light from his office disappear as the doors closed. She didn't breathe properly until she was back on street level. She walked 3 blocks before she realized she was still holding her phone with a half-typed text message on the screen. "On my way up, do you want—" She stared at it for a long time. Then she deleted it and kept walking. She didn't go home that night. She went to a diner on the east side that was open until 2 in the morning, sat in a corner booth, and drank 4 cups of coffee over 3 hours while a television above the counter played a muted game show. Nobody in the restaurant was watching. She thought about calling her older sister, Dana, who lived in Phoenix and who had said, exactly once, carefully and with the particular delicacy of someone who doesn't want to be right, that she hoped Vivian knew what she was getting into with a man like Luca Moretti. Vivian hadn't called her back for 2 weeks after that. She didn't call Dana now either. At some point around midnight, a waitress with kind eyes and a coffee pot appeared at her elbow and said, "You doing okay, honey?" in the automatic way of someone who asks it 40 times a shift and usually doesn't mean it. Vivian looked up at her. "I don't know yet," she said. That was the most honest thing she'd said in months. She ordered eggs she didn't eat. She paid. She walked out into the pre-dawn cold and stood on the sidewalk for a full minute before she could decide which direction to point herself. She went to her apartment, her real apartment, not the drawer she'd started keeping at his place, not the toothbrush in his second bathroom. Her apartment, the one with the cracked tile in the kitchen she'd been meaning to fix, and the radiator that knocked twice every hour like an impatient neighbor. She locked the door. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed, which she did sometimes when she was too tired to actually climb into it, and she put both hands flat on her stomach. 4 months along. She'd told him 2 weeks ago, sat across from him at that same kitchen table with the enormous windows and the view of the lake, and watched his face do something she'd never seen it do before. Go completely unguarded, completely open, like a shutter blowing back in a sudden wind. He'd been quiet for a long time. Then he'd reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Okay," he'd said, just that. But the way he'd said it, she'd believed him. She'd believed in the okay of it. She'd built 3 weeks of future around that single word. She sat on the floor of her apartment and tried to figure out which version of Luca Moretti was real. By the time she made her decision, it was 4 a.m. and she was calmer than she'd expected to be. Not at peace, not healed, just past the shaking, which sometimes has to be enough. She got up. She made a list. She was always someone who made lists when things became unbearable. It was one of the only things her mother had taught her that she still used. When you can't feel your way forward, think your way forward. One step at a time. The list was short, practical, brutal in the way that only lists made at 4 in the morning can be. She gave herself 3 days to disappear quietly. She took 5. She did not leave a note. She'd thought about it. She'd actually written 2 separate attempts, both of which she burned in her kitchen sink at midnight on day 4. Not because she couldn't find the words, because she found too many of them, and none of them were safe. Anything she put on paper could be used to locate her logic, trace her route, predict her destination. She left nothing. What she took: 2 duffel bags. Her passport. $3,000 in cash she'd been saving for no particular reason other than the instinct she'd always had that money you couldn't see on a bank statement was money that was truly yours. A prepaid debit card she bought at a gas station in a neighborhood on the south side where nobody would recognize her face. A fake name. Not elaborate, just Vivian Brooks. Her middle name and her mother's maiden name, easy to remember, simple enough that she wouldn't hesitate when someone called it, written on the inside of her wrist in ballpoint pen. She bought a bus ticket, not a plane ticket. Planes left records too clean, too easily pulled. The bus terminal at 5 a.m. was populated exclusively by people who had also decided they needed to be somewhere else without a lot of questions, and there was a certain grim comfort in that solidarity. She chose her destination the way she sometimes chose everything important in her life, not by logic, but by feel. She needed a small town. She needed water nearby because she had always thought better near water. She needed somewhere with enough tourist traffic that a new face wouldn't be remarkable, but enough genuine community that she could eventually find work, find footing, find something resembling a life. Seabrier was 430 miles away. She'd driven through it once, years before, on a road trip with a college roommate she'd since lost touch with. She remembered a harbor, a decent main street, a coffee shop with mismatched chairs. She remembered thinking it seemed like the kind of place where people actually stayed. She slept for most of the bus ride. Not because she was at peace, because her body had simply run out of anxiety to run on and had shut down the non-essential functions in order to keep the essential ones operating. She woke up to salt air and the sound of gulls and the bus driver calling the name of a town she was about to make her own. 6 years is a long time when you measure it in ordinary things. It's roughly 2,190 days of waking up in the same apartment above the waterfront, getting Ella dressed, walking down the back stairs, crossing 2 blocks to the Harbor Light Cafe where Vivian had worked for 5 years and 8 months, and starting the coffee machines at 6:15 a.m. while the rest of Seabrier was still deciding whether to be awake. Ella was a small, serious child until she wasn't, until something lit up in her at around age 3, and she became the loudest, most relentlessly curious person Vivian had ever met, which was both exhausting and the single best thing that had ever happened to her. She had Luca's eyes, dark, steady, the kind that didn't blink when they were thinking. Vivian had spent a considerable amount of time in the early years trying to decide how she felt about that, and eventually arrived at the complicated conclusion that she'd simply have to feel all of it simultaneously and keep moving. Ella called herself a scientist. She was 6. Her experiments included trying to determine whether snails could hear, whether rainwater tasted different than tap water, and whether their landlord's cat had a preference for classical music over pop. She kept a notebook. She had Vivian's handwriting, cramped, fast, slightly chaotic, and nobody's particular patience for being told something wasn't possible. Vivian loved her with a ferocity that sometimes frightened her. Not the love itself. The love was clean, absolute, uncomplicated in a way that nothing else in her life had managed to be. What frightened her was how much of her own survival had become tangled up in it. She'd caught herself once, standing outside Ella's school watching her daughter argue with a classmate over the correct name of a type of cloud, and thought, if anything happened to her, I wouldn't exist anymore. She'd pushed that thought down hard and gone back to her car and sat in it for 10 minutes before she could drive. She was not perfect. She was sometimes short-tempered in the mornings and too lenient about bedtime, and occasionally she let the apartment get to a state of mess that she'd have been embarrassed for anyone to see. She made promises she forgot, and then remembered at 11 p.m. with a lurch of guilt. She was afraid, quietly and persistently, of a future she couldn't fully see. But she was present. She was consistent. She was there every single day, and she had come to believe that consistent presence, showing up even when you were tired, even when you were sad, even when you had a hollow place in your chest that never quite filled, was what love actually looked like once you stripped away the romance of it. That had to be enough. Most days it was. The Tuesday morning it all changed was not a dramatic morning. The weather was ordinary. Ella had woken up late and was resistant about her shoes, and there had been a brief tense negotiation about whether she could bring her snail notebook to school. Vivian had said yes because she was tired and because some battles she'd simply stopped fighting. They were 7 minutes behind schedule. Vivian had dropped Ella at school, walked back to the apartment to grab the jacket she'd forgotten, and climbed the stairs in the particular dull rush of someone running on autopilot, already mentally at the cafe, already thinking about the order that usually came in on Tuesdays from the bakery on 4th Street. She reached the landing, knocked. She registered that for one disconnected second before her brain caught up with the reality of her own door, in her own apartment building, which she had just left and therefore did not need to knock on. She stopped. 3 knocks. Measured. Patient. Not a neighbor. Neighbors had rhythms. Mrs. Calloway's 2-knuckle tap, or Pete from downstairs who hammered the door like he was trying to break through it. This was none of those. This was the knock of someone who had been waiting a long time and had decided very carefully how to use it. She stood on the landing without moving. The key was already in her hand. She'd been reaching for the lock when the sound stopped her. The rational part of her brain produced a list of explanations. Postal service, a wrong address, a repairman someone had sent up by mistake. The part of her brain that had spent 6 years quietly, exhaustingly watching the perimeter of her life, without ever fully explaining to herself why. That part had gone completely silent, in the way that things go silent when they already know. She reached the door. She put her eye to the peephole. The man outside was looking slightly to the left, not at the door, not at the peephole, just patient and still in the hallway, the way someone stands when they've decided they're not leaving. He was older. The face was the same architecture. The jawline, the width of his shoulders, the way his hair broke over his forehead. But 6 years had moved through it, settled in it, added something that looked less like age and more like weight. Like he had been carrying something difficult for a long time and had gotten very good at not letting it show. Vivian's hand went flat against the door. Her lungs stopped cooperating. He was dressed plainly. Dark jacket, no tie. He looked improbably like a man who had walked here. Not like a man who'd arrived in a motorcade, not like someone conducting an operation. He looked like a man who had knocked on a door and was prepared to wait for as long as it took. Like he had practiced this exact moment, like he had rehearsed his own stillness. She pressed her back against the door and closed her eyes. The silence on both sides of the door lasted a long time, long enough that she thought for one desperate second that he might leave, that he might take his patience and his careful silence and his quiet knock and simply go. His voice came through the wood, low, controlled, no performance. Vivian. Not Vivian Brooks, just Vivian. Her real name in his voice, after 6 years of nobody saying it that way, like it was just a name, not a story, not an accusation, not a verdict. She didn't open the door. Not yet. She stood with her back against it and her hand pressed to her sternum and her eyes staring at the water stain on the opposite wall, and she thought about a girl who had once walked away from a half-typed text message and into a life she'd built from scratch. Then she turned around and put her hand on the knob, and she opened it. He was standing exactly as he'd been, hands visible, loose at his sides, not blocking the door, not leaning forward, just standing there in her narrow hallway, looking at her with those dark, steady eyes that Ella had inherited, and he said only 4 words. I'd like to meet her. Not where is she, not you owe me, not how could you. 4 words chosen with the same care he'd used to knock. Vivian's whole body went cold and then burning hot in the same second, and she understood, with a sudden devastating clarity, that this was not a man who had tracked her down in anger. This was a man who had known where they were for a very long time, and had knocked anyway. She didn't step back from the door. That was the first thing she noticed about herself, that her legs didn't retreat, that her body didn't do the thing it had practiced in nightmares 100 times. She just stood there in the doorframe with her hand still on the knob and looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a geologic amount of time. Then Vivian said, "How long have you known where we were?" The question came out steadier than she felt. Her voice didn't crack, which surprised her. Her throat was doing something complicated, but the words came out clean. Luca didn't look away. A year. The word landed like something dropped from a height. She absorbed it, stood there in the doorframe of her apartment in Seabriar on a Tuesday morning with Ella's snail notebook still sitting on the kitchen counter and a year echoing in the space between them. A year, she repeated. Yes. You've known where we were for a year, and you didn't... She stopped. Started again. You just waited. Yes. Why? It wasn't even a question the way she said it. It was something else. An accusation with the question mark removed. Luca shifted his weight slightly, the only concession to discomfort she'd seen him make. Because I didn't want you to run again. She stared at him. So instead of calling or sending someone or doing literally anything I did would have made you disappear. He said it matter-of-factly, not cruelly, not defensively, the way someone states a calculation they've already run 1,000 times. You're good at disappearing, Vivian, better than most people I've dealt with professionally. Don't do that. Do what? Make it sound like a compliment. He didn't answer that. He was watching her with that particular stillness she remembered. Not passive, not empty, but the stillness of a man who had trained himself to take in information before he responded to it. She used to find it reassuring. Right now it made her want to put her fist through the wall. "You should come in," she said finally, "or leave. But I'm not doing this in the hallway." She turned and walked back into the apartment without waiting to see which one he chose. He came in. She heard the door close behind him, quietly, carefully, the way you close a door in a house where someone might be sleeping. She went to the kitchen because it was the only room she knew what to do with her hands in, and she turned on the burner under the kettle without asking him if he wanted anything, because she needed something to do, and because the alternative was to stand in the middle of her living room and shake apart. She heard him stop somewhere behind her. She didn't turn around. "You look the same," he said. "Don't." "I'm not I said, "Don't." She turned around then. The kettle wasn't boiling yet, but she turned around because she didn't want to have this conversation with her back to him. "We're not doing that. We're not doing the thing where you say something like that and I don't know what to do with it. I can't afford that right now." He nodded, a single, careful nod. "Okay." "Okay." She crossed her arms. Her ribs felt like they were doing something involuntary. "She's at school." Something moved in his face, fast, controlled, but she caught it. "I know." "Of course you do." The bitterness was out before she could stop it. "A year, Luca. You've had a year of knowing where my daughter goes to school and where I work and probably what I order from the bakery on Tuesdays, and you just—" Her voice finally did the thing she'd been afraid it would do. It roughened. "You just let us live our life." "Yes." "Why is that supposed to make me feel safe?" "I didn't say it was supposed to make you feel anything." He wasn't raising his voice. That was the maddening part. She was close to the edge of herself, and he was standing in her kitchen with his hands in his jacket pockets speaking at the same volume he'd used to order coffee. "I'm telling you what I did and why I did it. What you feel about it is yours." "What I feel about it." She laughed. It came out wrong, short and sharp. "What I feel about it." 6 years, Luca. "I know." "You don't get to just say I know and have that cover it." "I'm not trying to cover anything." For the first time, something tightened in his jaw, a hairline fracture in the controlled surface. "I came here to see my daughter. That's it. That's the whole conversation. I'm not here to relitigate anything or to make you explain yourself. I came to this door and I knocked, and I waited for you to open it. And if I hadn't—" He looked at her steadily. "I would have knocked tomorrow." The kettle started to scream. She turned and pulled it off the burner and stood there with her back to him again, 2 cups on the counter, and she poured 1 cup without thinking about it, and then stood there staring at the second empty cup, and something about it, the automatic muscle memory of making 2 cups, the way her hands had done it before her brain could stop them, made her close her eyes for a second and just breathe. She poured the second cup. She turned around and set it on the table. He pulled out the chair and sat down. She sat across from him, which put them in the same configuration they'd spent countless evenings in, at his table, at her table, at restaurant tables and hotel room tables, and once memorably on the floor of her old apartment eating takeout because she hadn't owned enough furniture yet. She wrapped both hands around her cup. "She doesn't know about you," Vivian said. "She knows she has a father. I didn't tell her you were dead or that you didn't exist. But she doesn't know your name." "What does she know?" "That her dad and I didn't work out, that it was complicated, that it wasn't her fault." She paused. She stopped asking detailed questions around age 4. Kids are practical. She decided she had enough people who showed up and moved on. Luca was quiet for a moment. His thumb ran along the edge of the cup, once, back and forth. "She sounds like you." "She's not like me. She's braver than me." Vivian looked at him across the table. "She has your eyes." That landed differently than she'd intended it to. She'd meant it as information, just a fact being transferred, but it came out like something else. An admission, maybe, or a small door left open by accident. Luca looked down at his cup. "What do you want?" Vivian asked. "Specifically. Not, I want to see my daughter. What does that look like? What are you asking for?" He raised his eyes. "Time." How much time? I don't know yet. That's not an answer. It's the honest answer. Something shifted in how he was sitting. Not a slump, Luca Moretti didn't slump, but a slight release like a door settling on its hinges. I'm not here to rearrange your life. I'm not asking you to come back to Chicago. I'm not putting legal paperwork on the table. I'm asking to meet her, and I'm asking for whatever you decide that looks like. Vivian studied him. 6 years had taught her to look for the gap between what people said and how they breathed when they said it. The gap in Luca was smaller than she'd expected, smaller than she wanted it to be, because a smaller gap made everything harder. You could have sent lawyers, she said. You could have filed for custody. You have more resources than... You could have destroyed this life I built in about 48 hours if you'd wanted to. Yes. Why didn't you? He met her eyes directly. Because she's my daughter, not a negotiating position. The silence that followed was the long kind, the kind that has weight. Vivian sat with it. She turned her cup in her hands. She thought about Ella this morning, resistant about her shoes, the snail notebook tucked under one arm, the specific way she said "bye, Mom" over her shoulder when she didn't want to be fussed over at the school gate. Casual, unbothered, like she was just stepping out for a moment and would be right back. I need to think, Vivian said finally. Okay. Not today. Give me until she's out of school. I need a few hours. I'll be at the Anchor Inn on Harbor Street. He pushed back from the table and stood. He left the coffee, most of it undrunk. Room 7, knock whenever. She walked him to the door. At the threshold he stopped and turned, and for a second she thought he was going to say something with weight to it, something she'd have to dismantle and examine and carry around for the rest of the day. Instead, he just looked at her with that face she'd spent 6 years trying to stop dreaming about. For what it's worth, he said, I didn't look for you the way you probably thought I did. She waited. I looked for you because I needed to know you were alive. He said it quietly, almost clinically, like a man reading a report he'd memorized. Once I knew that, I stopped. I found out about Ella by accident. Someone who recognized you, 8 months ago, traveling through. They told me. A pause. I fired them for it. She stared at him. Knowing you existed and were safe was one thing, but knowing about her? He stopped. Something crossed his face that she hadn't seen before. Not guilt exactly. Something more structural than guilt, more foundational. I couldn't unknow it. He left. She stood in the open doorway and listened to his footsteps go down the stairs, unhurried even, the footsteps of a man who had made his move and was at peace with it. And she stayed there until the building door at the bottom opened and closed. Then she shut her own door and pressed her forehead against it. She had approximately 4 hours before she needed to pick up Ella. She spent the first hour cleaning things that were already clean, which was what she did when her brain needed her hands occupied. She wiped down the kitchen counters. She reorganized the shelf above the sink that didn't need reorganizing. She found one of Ella's crayons behind the refrigerator, Shwoyin, green, mostly used down, and held it for a moment before setting it on the counter. The second hour she spent sitting in the armchair by the window that looked out over the harbor, watching fishing boats move in and out in the fog, and trying to have a clear thought that wasn't immediately undermined by the thought behind it. She kept arriving at the same place, the same wall. He had known where they were for a year and had not used it. That was a fact. She could argue with the implications of it. She could turn it sideways and look for the manipulation in it, but the fact itself sat there solid and immovable. A year. He'd knocked twice on her door and both times had used 4 words or fewer. She thought about the man she'd seen through the crack in that office door 6 years ago. The gun, the calm, the finality. She thought about the way she'd reconstructed that memory over time, the way trauma does to memory, wearing the edges smooth in some places and making them sharper in others. She thought about what she actually knew and what she'd filled in with fear. She thought about Ella's dark eyes, unblinking, holding something steady in their depths. She picked up her phone and called Dana in Phoenix. Dana picked up on the second ring, which meant she wasn't at work yet. Hey, what's wrong? Why do you assume something's wrong? Because you call me on Tuesday mornings approximately never. A beat. Viv, what happened? He found us. The silence on the other end had a specific texture. Dana had never said "I told you so" in her life. Not once, not about anything, which was one of the reasons Vivian had been able to call her at all. "Okay," Dana said. "Are you safe right now?" "Yes. He knocked on my door. He asked to meet Ella." Vivian pressed the phone harder against her ear. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't anything. He just asked. "And?" "I told him I needed to think." Another pause. Dana was a middle school librarian who had the particular gift of knowing when to let silence do the work. "What do you need from me right now?" "I don't know." Vivian's voice went thin for a second. She pulled it back. "I don't know what the right thing is." "There might not be a right thing," Dana said. "Sometimes it's just two wrong things, and you pick the one that's more survivable." Vivian looked out at the harbor. A gull landed on a piling and immediately lost its footing in the wind and had to scramble to stay on. "She deserves to know him," Vivian said. It came out quiet, almost reluctant, like a confession. "Yeah," Dana said. "She probably does. I hate that." "I know. It would be so much easier if he'd shown up furious, if he'd come here with lawyers or with anything that I could point at and say that's why we ran. But he didn't. He brought himself and 4 words and a cup of coffee he didn't finish." Dana made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "What were the 4 words?" "I'd like to meet her." Silence. Then, "Vivian, you have to let him." She already knew that. She'd known it the moment she'd opened the door and seen his face. Knowing it and being ready for what came next were 2 entirely different animals, and only one of them was sitting calmly in her chest. She hung up 20 minutes later and sat with the harbor and the fog until it was time to get Ella. She didn't tell Ella that afternoon. She needed to see Luca first, to establish something with clearer edges, before she tried to explain to a 6-year-old that the word complicated was about to become very concrete. She dropped Ella at Mrs. Calloway's. A standing arrangement. Ella loved Mrs. Calloway's enormous orange cat, and Mrs. Calloway loved the company. And she walked to Harbor Street as the afternoon light started to go amber and thin. The Anchor Inn was a 2-story building the color of old cream, 9 rooms, a small office in the front run by a man named Gerald, who'd been there since the inn opened, and who would remember every face that checked in and say nothing about any of them. She'd always liked that about Gerald. She knocked on room 7. Luca opened it within seconds. He'd changed. Different jacket, no tie, same careful face. He stepped back to let her in without saying anything, which she was starting to recognize as his particular courtesy. He never crowded her with his presence, never tried to fill the room before she'd had a chance to settle into it. The room was small, 1 window facing the harbor, a chair, a bed, a table with 2 chairs. He'd left the chair by the window angled slightly outward, like he'd been sitting in it, a phone on the table and nothing else. She sat in the other chair. He sat in his. "I'll introduce you to her," Vivian said, "on a trial basis. One afternoon. We tell her you're a friend of mine from a long time ago who's in town for a few days. We don't talk about the rest of it yet. We don't use the word father until she and I have had a separate conversation and she's had time to, whatever you need." "Don't just agree to things to get through the door," she said sharply. "I need to know you'll hold to it." "I'll hold to it." She looked at him. "If she asks you questions about who you are and why you haven't been around, you deflect. You don't lie to her, but you don't open doors I haven't opened yet." "Agreed." "And if at any point she gets uncomfortable, or I call it, we leave. Immediately. No negotiating, no 5 more minutes." "Vivian," he said her name evenly. "I'm not going to put her in a situation she can't leave. She's 6. She held his gaze. He held hers back without flinching, without softening, without any of the tells that men used when they were managing rather than meaning. She let out a breath. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Then she asked the question. The one she'd been carrying for 6 years, around her throat like a knot pulled tight. The one she'd rehearsed and discarded 100 different ways, in 100 different registers, furious, cold, clinical, wrecked, and still couldn't find the right container for. Was he innocent? The question sat in the room. Luca's expression didn't change, didn't shift sideways, didn't try to root itself into something easier. He looked at her directly, the way he'd looked at everything tonight, like he'd decided before he came here that he was done managing her perception of him. No, he said. He wasn't. She waited. He wasn't a civilian. He wasn't someone who wandered into something he didn't understand. He spoke slowly, each word placed with deliberate weight. He was one of mine. He'd been with my family for 11 years. He had access to everything. A pause. Including your name. Something cold moved through her chest. What does that mean? She said. Flat, careful. Luca's jaw tightened by 1 degree. 3 weeks before that night, I found out he'd sold information about our operations to a rival family. He stopped. And about you. She was very still. About the pregnancy, he said. The word pregnancy in his voice after 6 years was almost unbearable. She pushed past it. What kind of information? Your name, your address, what you meant to me. He said that last part without inflection, like he was reading it from a page. In our world, what you meant to me made you a liability. To them. His eyes didn't move from hers. The order to move against you was already in motion before I found out. I had approximately 18 hours to stop it. The room contracted. You're saying, Vivian said slowly, that what I saw that night was you stopping it. She sat very still. She had built 6 years on the image of his face in that room. Calm, resolved, capable of something that put him in a category of person she could not allow near her child. She had used that image as the foundation stone of every decision she'd made since. Every early shift and every lonely night and every deflected question from Ella and every moment she'd told herself the distance was necessary and right. She sat across from him in a small room in Seabriar and felt the foundation stone move. Why didn't you? Her voice cracked. She pushed through it. Why didn't you find a way to tell me? A message? Anything? I tried. Something in his face went old briefly. I went to your apartment that same night, after. He stopped. You were already gone. She thought about the diner, the 4 cups of coffee, the bus at 5 in the morning, the 10 hours between walking away from his building and walking onto that bus. 10 hours in which she'd been reachable. 10 hours she'd spent dismantling her life instead of asking the question. She stood up from the chair abruptly. Not toward him, not away, just upright, because sitting felt impossible. She put her hand on the windowsill and looked out at the harbor where the light had gone gray-blue and the boats were dark shapes on dark water. She heard Luca stand. She heard him take 1 step. Don't, she said quietly. He stopped. She stood at the window for a long time, long enough that the lights on the dock came on, one by one, small and steady against the dark. I need you to go, she said finally. Her voice had gone flat. Not angry, depleted. The tone of someone who has just been handed information they can't process standing up. Tonight, I need the rest of tonight. Of course. Tomorrow afternoon, 3 o'clock. Come to the cafe on the harbor. Harbor Light. Ask for me. She turned from the window. Her face felt stiff. Ella gets out of school at 2:30. I'll have her with me. He nodded. No relief on his face, no victory, just that same measured steadiness. She picked up her jacket from the chair and walked to the door. She had her hand on the knob when his voice came from behind her. Vivian. She stopped. Didn't turn. I should have found a way. To reach you. After. A pause. I know that. She stood in the doorway with her back to him and her hand on the knob, and she didn't say anything because there was nothing to say to that wasn't also, somehow, a crack in something she needed to keep solid until she got home. She left. She walked back along Harbor Street in the dark, past the cafe and the tackle shop and the ice cream stand that was closed for the season. And she walked fast, not because she was afraid of anything behind her, but because her body needed to do something with what her mind had just been handed. She collected Ella from Mrs. Calloway's at 7:30. Ella was wound up, full of observations about the cat, and a theory she'd developed about whether cats had a language or just a set of sounds, and she talked all the way up the stairs and through dinner, and Vivian listened and responded in the right places and made a pasta that nobody complained about, which was a moderate success. She She read Ella 2 chapters of the book they were working through together. She turned out the light. She stood in the hallway outside Ella's door for a while. Then she went to the kitchen and stood at the counter in the dark, not turning on any lights. And she thought about 10 hours, about a bus at 5 in the morning, about the terrible arithmetic of the timing. She thought about tomorrow at 3 o'clock. She thought about Ella's face when she was curious about something, the particular focus that came over it, the way her head tipped slightly to the left, the unblinking dark eyes that saw more than most adults wanted to be seen by. She thought, she's going to know immediately, and beneath that, quieter, harder to look at. So will he. And beneath even that, the thing she'd been pushing down since the moment he'd said the word pregnancy with that careful, expressionless voice. If she had asked the question 6 years ago, if she had knocked on that door instead of backing away from it, none of this would have been built on a misunderstanding. 6 years. Ella growing up without him waiting in a city 400 miles away. The entire architecture of their separate lives, all of it resting on 10 hours she'd spent in a diner not asking the question. She stood in her dark kitchen for a long time. Then, somewhere out in the water, a boat horn sounded, low, mournful, carrying, and something shifted in her chest, not breaking exactly, but moving, the way ice moves when the temperature underneath it changes. She thought about tomorrow, and for the first time in 6 years, she didn't know which outcome she was more afraid of. That Luca Moretti would turn out to be exactly the man she'd convinced herself he was, or that he wouldn't. She didn't sleep that night. Not really. She lay on her side facing the wall and did the thing that passed for sleep when your mind refused to fully go offline. A shallow, restless hovering just beneath consciousness, where dreams and thoughts blurred together and you woke every 40 minutes feeling like you'd been running. By 5:30 she was up. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the harbor come gray out of the dark, the fishing boats moving out early, the gulls working the water. She thought about the conversation ahead. She thought about Ella's face, the specific face she made when she was being introduced to something new and was pretending to be casual about it while actually cataloging everything. She thought, 3 o'clock, 6 hours away. I can do 6 hours. She got Ella up at 7. Normal routine. Oatmeal, half finished. Ella's running commentary about a dream she'd had involving a whale that could do arithmetic. Vivian braided her hair the way Ella liked it, 2 braids slightly uneven because Vivian had never been particularly skilled at it, and Ella had long since stopped pointing this out. At the school gate, Ella said, "Bye, Mom," over her shoulder, without slowing down, already locked onto a classmate across the yard, and Vivian stood there and watched her go with a feeling in her chest that had no clean name. Then she went to work. She was 20 minutes early, which Gerald at the counter noticed and didn't comment on, which she appreciated. She started the machines. She wiped tables. She took orders and made change and smiled at people she recognized and made small talk that she could not have repeated 5 minutes after it happened. At 2:15, she untied her apron and told her coworker Bess she needed to step out to get her daughter and would be back in 20. She picked up Ella. On the walk back, she said carefully, "Hey, someone's coming by the cafe this afternoon, a friend of mine, from a long time ago. He's in town for a few days." Ella was bouncing slightly as she walked, which she did when she had excess energy and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. "From where?" "Chicago, where I used to live." "Before me?" "And a little bit during you." Ella processed this for a half block. "Is he nice?" Vivian kept her voice even. "I think so. He's someone I used to know very well." Ella looked up at her, quick, sharp, the way she did when she thought there was more information available than was being offered. "Okay," she said, and went back to bouncing. They walked through the cafe door at 2:48. Luca was already there. He was sitting at the corner table by the window. Not the most visible table, not the most hidden one, exactly the middle option, which she recognized as deliberate. He was wearing a plain gray sweater, no jacket. He looked, against all reason, like someone who belonged in a harbor town. He'd ordered coffee. He was looking out the window at the boats, and he turned when they came in, and his eyes went immediately to Ella. Vivian felt the moment land in her body like a physical weight. Ella stopped walking. She stood beside Vivian's left knee and looked across the cafe at Luca Moretti with those dark, unblinking eyes, and Vivian watched something happen in Luca's face that she had never seen before. A total, unguarded opening, like every door in a house blown wide at once. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then the control came back, quiet and practiced, but she'd seen it. So, she suspected, had Ella. "Come on," Vivian said softly. They crossed the cafe. Vivian pulled out a chair for Ella and sat down herself and said, "Ella, this is Luca. Luca, this is Ella." Luca looked at the child across the small table. Ella looked at him. A long second passed. "You have the same eyes as me," Ella said. Nobody spoke. Ella looked at her mother, then back at Luca. She was 6, but she was not, had never been, a child who required things to be spelled out for her. She had her mother's particular gift for reading a room and her father's gift for sitting still inside uncomfortable information. "Okay," she said again, and reached across the table and picked up one of the sugar packets and began carefully reading the nutrition label. Vivian's throat tightened so hard she had to look out the window. Luca recovered first. He said to Ella, "What grade are you in?" "First," Ella said without looking up from the sugar packet. "What's your teacher's name?" "Ms. Park." A pause. "She's okay. She doesn't like it when I talk during reading time, but I already read fast, so I don't know what she wants me to do." "What do you do instead of waiting?" Ella looked up then. A slight reassessment. "I write things down. I have a notebook." "What kind of things?" "Observations." She said the word with precision, like she'd worked to acquire it and was pleased to have occasion to use it. "About how things work, and whether animals know things we don't know they know." Something in Luca's expression shifted. Careful, attentive, fully present. "Do you have a hypothesis yet?" Ella stared at him. "You know what hypothesis means?" "I do." "Mom had to explain it to me." She shot Vivian a brief, assessing look. "She took a while." "I explained it fine," Vivian said. "You said it was a fancy word for a guess." Ella turned back to Luca. "It's more than a guess. It's a guess with reasons." "You're right," Luca said. "It is." Ella sat back in her chair with the particular satisfaction of a person who has been correctly agreed with. She put down the sugar packet. She looked at Luca for a long, measured moment. Then she said, "Are you my dad?" The word moved through the table like a current. Vivian's hand went flat on the tabletop. Luca held completely still. He didn't look at Vivian for permission or rescue. He kept his eyes on Ella, and he said, "Yes." Ella nodded. One nod. Slow, considered. The nod of someone filing information in its correct location. "Okay," she said, for the third time. And then to Vivian, "Can I get hot chocolate?" Vivian looked at her daughter, this small, serious, impossible person she'd built a life around. "Yeah," she said, "you can get hot chocolate." She got up to order it because she needed 20 seconds standing at the counter with her back to both of them, pressing her fingers to her sternum, breathing through something that had no category. Bess made the hot chocolate without being asked. Vivian stood at the counter, long enough that Bess said, "You okay?" And Vivian said, which Bess accepted because she was a good person who understood the value of not pushing. When Vivian came back to the table, Ella was telling Luca about the snail experiment, and Luca was listening with his elbows on the table and his full attention on her daughter the way he used to give his full attention to things he considered important. Vivian set the hot chocolate down and sat, and for the next 40 minutes she watched Luca Moretti meet his daughter. It was not a dramatic 40 minutes. It was small and ordinary and ruthlessly human. Ella talked too much, which was normal. Luca asked questions, which were good questions, which Vivian had not been prepared for. Ella spilled a small amount of hot chocolate on her sleeve and was unbothered by it. Luca handed her a napkin without making a production of it. At 4 o'clock, Vivian said it was time to head home for dinner. Ella climbed off her chair and then stopped and looked at Luca. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked. Luca glanced at Vivian, one quick, careful look, then back to Ella. "I'll be in town for a little while." Ella absorbed this. "Okay." She picked up her school bag. "You should come see my notebook sometime. I have good drawings." "I'd like that," Luca said. Ella nodded and walked to the door and held it open with one small hand, looking back at her mother with the universal expression of a child who is ready to leave and has said their piece. Vivian stood. She looked at Luca across the table. The afternoon light was low and copper-colored through the window, and it did something to the planes of his face that she didn't examine closely. "Same time tomorrow?" he said. "We'll see," she said. But they both knew what that meant. She left with Ella, and the door of the Harbor Light Cafe swung shut behind them, and Vivian walked back through the harbor town she'd spent 6 years building in the long amber afternoon, and she thought that the most terrifying thing in the world wasn't being found. It was discovering that being found felt, against every instinct and every wall she'd constructed, like something close to relief. She didn't allow herself to sit with that for long. The next 4 days had a quality she hadn't anticipated, ordinary on the surface, suspended underneath. Luca came to the cafe each afternoon. He and Ella talked about snails, about the ocean, about whether fish had opinions. Vivian sat and watched and occasionally joined and occasionally made herself busy at the counter, so they had space. On the third day, Ella told him about a boy at school who'd said her notebook was stupid, and Luca listened to this with an expression so precisely calibrated between neutral and furious that Vivian had to look down at her coffee. On the fourth day, Ella brought the notebook. That was the day Vivian knew something had shifted in a direction she couldn't push back from. She and Luca were left briefly alone while Ella went to the bathroom, and he said quietly, without preamble, "I want to talk to you tonight, after she's asleep." Vivian looked at him. "About what?" "About the reason I came here when I came here, not just Ella." Something tightened in his face. Not fear. Luca Moretti did not do fear in any visible register, but the face of a man about to say something he has held too long. "There are things you need to know." "Things," she repeated. "One thing, one specific thing." He was looking at her steadily. "Tonight." She said yes because she could see in the set of his jaw that the alternative to her agreeing was him telling her right now, here in the cafe, and she didn't want that. She put Ella to bed at 8:30. Ella pushed for 9, cited several reasons, all of them invalid, and fell asleep mid-argument at 8:45 with her notebook open on her chest. Vivian extracted it carefully and turned off the light. She texted Luca from the kitchen. "She's asleep. Come over." He knocked 8 minutes later. She opened the door and the look on his face stopped her before she could step back. It was not the face he'd been wearing all week, the controlled, patient face, the face he'd brought to the door that first Tuesday morning. This was something else underneath it, something that had been pressing upward for days and had finally reached the surface. She stepped back. He came in. He didn't sit down. That was the first signal. Every other conversation this week he'd sat. He stood in her kitchen and he put both hands flat on the counter the way someone does when they need something solid, and he said, "I've been followed." The room got very quiet. "Since when?" Vivian said. "I first noticed it 3 days before I came here. I thought I'd handled it." His jaw was tight. "I was wrong." "Handled it how?" "I redirected, changed my route, spent a week in Milwaukee before I came to Seabrier to break the trail." But whoever is running the operation is better than the people I redirected." He looked at her. "They know I'm here." She felt it before she understood it, a cold drop through the center of her chest. "Who?" "The Bellanova family." He said the name evenly. "The family whose patriarch I've been in a slow war with for 11 years. The family that bought the information from the man you saw me." He stopped, reorganized. "They've been watching me for 3 months, waiting for me to lead them to something they could use." She understood. "And you led them here," she said. Her voice came out flat. "I believed I'd broken the trail." He said it without excuse in his voice, but without hiding behind the fact either. "I was wrong." "You were wrong," she said. "And now they know you exist. They likely know about Ella." She sat down. Not because she chose to. Her legs made the decision. She sat at the kitchen table in the same chair she'd sat in the morning. He'd come through her door, and she put both hands flat on the table the way he had his on the counter, and she stared at the wood grain, and she breathed. "How long?" she said. "I don't know, hours maybe. Or they're already in position and waiting for a specific window." He came to the table but didn't sit. He stood beside it, above her, and she could feel the tension in him from 2 feet away. Not fear, but the coiled cellular readiness of a man who had spent his life operating in situations where the margin between action and ruin was measured in seconds. "My people are already moving. I made calls on the way here. There will be—" "Your people." She looked up at him. "You have people. Here. In my town." "I had 2 men in place the day I arrived. Precautionary. I added 4 more this morning when I confirmed the surveillance." "You've had men in my town for a week, and you didn't tell me." He met her eyes. "No." She stood up. The chair scraped back hard. "You didn't tell me. I didn't want to frighten you before I knew how serious it was. That is not your decision to make." Her voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It had gone to the low register she used when she was past anger and into something colder. "This is my home. That is my daughter asleep in that room. You do not get to make decisions about what I know about the danger around my own child." "You're right. Don't agree with me to end the argument." "I'm not." He said it sharply, the first sharp thing she'd heard from him all week, a crack in the surface. "I'm agreeing with you because you're right. I made a call I shouldn't have made unilaterally. That's accurate. But I cannot spend time on it right now because what I need is for you to hear what I'm telling you and make a decision." She stared at him. He stared back. Then she said, "What decision?" "You and Ella need to move. Tonight, preferably. I have a location. We're not going anywhere with your people." "Vivian, we are not getting in a car with men I don't know and going to a location I don't know because you've decided it's safe." She was breathing harder now. "That is not happening. Then tell me what you need it to look like." He moved toward her, not crowding, just closing the distance by 2 feet. "I'm not asking you to trust my judgment on everything, but I need you to understand that the people who are watching this town right now are not here to negotiate. They came to eliminate my bloodline. That includes Ella." The word eliminate hit her the way it was meant to, clean and horrible. She turned away. She put her hand over her mouth. She stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark water, and she let herself feel it for exactly 10 seconds. The vertigo of it, the obscene wrongness of that word in proximity to her daughter's name. And then she packed it down. "How many men do you have here?" she said. 6, plus me." "And how many do they likely have?" "Unknown. Bellanova operates in teams, minimum 4 per target. So it could be more." "Yes." She turned around. "What's the location?" Something in his posture shifted. Not relief, just the recalibration of a man who has been waiting for the pivot point. "Coastal route. There's an inlet 8 miles south, a private property I have access to. It's defensible, it's off any map they'd be working from, and it has a road access in 3 directions." "How do we get there?" "Back roads." "My men know the route. It would be 2 cars, staggered departure. One goes first to confirm the road is clear." "I want to be in the first car." "No, the second car is safer. The first car draws—" "I want to be in the first car with Ella. I am not sending my daughter ahead into a situation I can't see." She held his gaze. "That's the line. That's the only line I'm drawing. Everything else I'll listen to. But she stays with me." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him doing the calculation, running the variables, measuring what he could guarantee and what he couldn't. "First car," he said finally. "With me." "And you drive?" "Yes." She moved toward Ella's room. At the door she stopped and turned back to him. "If anything happens to her," she said, not as a threat, not theatrical, just factual, the way he stated things. "I don't care what comes before or after or what the explanation is. There is no version of any of this I survive." He looked at her across the kitchen. "Nothing is going to happen to her," he said. "You don't know that." "No." He held her gaze. "But I know what I'm willing to do to make it true." She went into Ella's room. She stood over her daughter in the dark. Ella was on her back, one arm thrown out, the particular boneless abandon of a sleeping child. The notebook had migrated to the floor. Vivian picked it up and set it on the bedside table. She put one hand very lightly on Ella's hair. She thought about the morning 6 years ago, the bus station in the dark, the prepaid debit card, the name on the inside of her wrist. She thought about the life she'd built out of exactly that, a name and a card and a direction on a compass. She thought about how she'd believed for 6 years that the running had been the act of courage. She was beginning to suspect, standing in the dark over her sleeping daughter, that the running had actually been the easiest thing. That the thing requiring genuine courage was this, standing still in the fire instead of away from it. She bent down and kissed Ella's temple. Ella stirred, didn't wake, turned slightly onto her side with a small sound, a child's unconscious anchoring to the world around her. "Hey," Vivian said softly. "Hey, Bug, I need you to wake up a little." Ella's eyes opened, unfocused, slow. "Hmm? We're going on a trip, tonight, right now." Vivian kept her voice level, warm, the voice she used when she was asking Ella to trust her on something that didn't come with a full explanation. "It's an adventure. You can bring the notebook." Ella looked at her, still half asleep, but that alert center of her never quite went fully offline. Her dark eyes moved over her mother's face in the dark. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Vivian held her daughter's gaze. "It's going to be," she said. She helped Ella into her shoes. She zipped her into her jacket. She took the notebook and put it in her bag along with 3 changes of clothes and Ella's small stuffed rabbit that she'd had since she was 2 and still slept with, and would deny if asked. She took her own documents, the cash envelope from under the bathroom sink, her phone charger. She had it all done in 7 minutes. She'd been unconsciously maintaining the ability to do that for 6 years. She came out of the hallway with Ella's hand in hers and Ella's bag on her shoulder and found Luca in the kitchen with his phone to his ear. He looked at them, at her, then at Ella, small and sleepy-eyed and trusting in the way children trust when the adult holding their hand hasn't given them a reason not to yet. And he said something brief into the phone and ended the call. "Ready," Vivian said. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not admiration exactly, something quieter and more complicated. Like recognition. "Car's out back," he said. "Side alley." She nodded. She looked around the apartment once. The mismatched chairs, the herbs on the windowsill, the cracked kitchen tile she'd never fixed, the radiator that knocked twice an hour, the life she'd built from a name on her wrist and a bus ticket. She turned off the kitchen light. They went out the back. The alley was dark and smelled of salt and damp asphalt. Luca moved ahead of them by 2 steps, which she understood was deliberate, putting his body between the mouth of the alley and them. And she kept Ella close and kept her own eyes on the shadows at the alley entrance. And she thought, this is what it cost. This was the hidden price tag on the life she'd thought they'd escaped into. Not Luca, not the world he came from, but the fact that the world had no interest in whether she'd opted out of it. A dark sedan sat at the alley mouth. A man she didn't know was behind the wheel. Another stood at the back passenger door and opened it when he saw them coming. Ella looked up at the man and said, "Hi." The man looked startled. "Hi," he said. "I'm Ella," she said. "Marco," he said, after a moment. "That's a good name," Ella said, and climbed into the car. Vivian got in beside her. Luca got in the front. Marco got in, and they pulled out of the alley onto a side street and the town of Seabriar, the harbor, the cafe, the school, with the gate where Ella said "Bye, Mom" over her shoulder, slid past the windows in the dark. Ella leaned against Vivian's arm. Within minutes, her breathing evened out. Vivian stared out the window. She didn't watch the town disappear. She watched the road ahead, the cones of light from the headlights cutting through coastal dark. And she thought about what she'd said to Luca in the kitchen. "There is no version of this I survive." She'd meant it as a statement of fact, a description of the stakes as she understood them. What she hadn't said, and what she was only now, in the moving car in the dark, beginning to fully recognize, was the second half of it, the part that followed from the first. If there was no version she survived in which Ella was harmed, then there was also no version in which she could afford to be the person she'd been for the last 6 years. The woman who ran. The woman who made decisions alone in the dark and called it survival. The car turned off the main road onto a coastal track she didn't know, and the headlights swept across water, and somewhere behind them in Seabriar, men she hadn't seen were watching for other men she didn't know, and her daughter slept against her arm with the absolute trust of someone who believed, without needing to be told, that the person beside her would not let the dark in. Vivian sat straight in the seat. She looked at the back of Luca's head. She thought, I am done running. I am done. Then from the front seat, Luca's phone lit up. He looked at it. 1 second, 2 seconds. He said very quietly to Marco, they're not behind us. Marco said, where? Luca said, ahead. Marco hit the brakes. Not hard. A controlled deceleration, the kind that didn't throw anyone forward but got the car stopped in 4 seconds flat. He did it without being told, which meant he'd seen what Luca had seen on the phone. Vivian's hand went to Ella automatically, palm flat against her daughter's sternum. Ella woke up. Not startled. She surfaced the way she always did, fast and oriented, those dark eyes going immediately to her mother's face to read the temperature of the room. Mom. Stay still, Vivian said quietly. Just stay still for a second. In the front seat, Luca and Marco were doing the thing that people did when they'd worked together long enough that words were mostly redundant. A series of quick glances, a tilt of the head, Marco's hand already moving to something under the dash. How far? Marco said. Roadblock. Quarter mile. Maybe less. Luca's voice was level. The voice he used, she now understood, when the situation was bad enough that panic would be a luxury he couldn't afford. They've got the coastal road sealed. Other route. Back through town puts us on the main road. They'll have that too. He turned. Not fully. He turned enough to look at Vivian over his shoulder, and in the low glow of the dashboard she could see his face doing the rapid, brutal calculus of a man with too many variables and not enough time. There's an access road, fishing industry, half a mile back on the left. It runs along the bluff to the inlet. How wide? 1 car. Marco exhaled through his nose. And if someone's on it? Then we deal with that. Luca's eyes moved to Ella, then back to Vivian. It's the only option that doesn't put us in open ground. Vivian looked at him. She felt her heartbeat in her teeth. Do it. Marco reversed. No headlights. He killed them before he started backing up, which turned the world outside the windows into shades of dark gray, and Vivian tightened her hand on Ella and felt Ella grip her fingers back, small and warm, and saying nothing. They went back in the dark at speed, and Vivian focused on keeping her breathing even because Ella was watching her, and children read their parents' bodies the way animals read weather. Who are they? Ella asked. People who don't like your father very much, Vivian said. A beat. Do they know about me? Ella asked. Vivian kept her eyes forward. Hopefully not. Ella was quiet for a moment, then, I have the notebook in my bag. I know. I just want you to know it's in there, in case we have to run somewhere. Vivian's throat tightened. Good thinking. Marco found the access road, just barely, a gap in the coastal scrub, no sign, the kind of road that existed on fishing charts and nowhere else. He turned in and the car dropped off the paved surface, and they were immediately on packed dirt that punished the suspension. The scrub on both sides was close enough to touch the mirrors. Luca was on his phone. Short sentences, nothing she could follow. Names she didn't know, directional language, once a sharp monosyllable that sounded like a rebuke. He ended 2 calls and made a third. Costa, he said into the phone. Tell me you're mobile. A pause. Where? Another pause. His jaw tightened by a degree. Get there. Now. He ended the call. My men at the south perimeter got cut off, he said. Not to Vivian specifically, just stating the situation into the car. They're rerouting. How many does that leave us with, Marco said. 3 in position at the inlet, plus us. Marco absorbed this, said nothing. 3, Vivian said. It's enough, Luca said. You don't know that. No, but it's what we have. He turned to look at her properly this time, half turned in the passenger seat, and in the ambient dark she could see something in his face that was not reassurance and not false confidence. It was the look of a man who had already decided what he was willing to spend and who was at peace with the cost. The inlet has natural cover, stone breakwater on 3 sides. If we get there first, the car stopped. Marco said contact in the same flat tone he would have used for any other word, and then everything happened very fast. Headlights, sudden and brutal, from the tree line to their left. Not one set, 2, angled to catch the road and anyone on it. And voices, not loud but immediate, the sharp-edged commands of men who'd done this before. "Out of the car," Vivian said to Ella. "My side. Now." She had the door open before she'd finished the sentence. She pulled Ella across the seat and out, and they hit the ground, and she got behind the rear wheel and pulled Ella in against her, crouched, Ella's back to her chest, and she put her mouth close to her daughter's ear. "Don't move. Don't make a sound. Whatever you hear, you stay right here." Ella nodded. She had stopped being a 6-year-old in the last 30 seconds in some essential way. Not that she'd gone cold. She was trembling slightly, and her fingers were locked around Vivian's forearm, but her eyes were open and she wasn't making a sound, and she was pressed in tight the way Vivian had asked. Doing exactly what was needed. From the other side of the car came sounds Vivian couldn't fully interpret. Movement, a collision, something heavy. Then Luca's voice, sharp. "Vivian, move." She moved. She pulled Ella up, and they went along the side of the car in a crouch, and around the front, and Vivian looked up long enough to read the situation. Marco was between her and the tree line. 2 men from the undergrowth, close. Luca was ahead of them on the road, facing a 3rd man who had come around from the other direction. "Ella, run when I say run. Straight ahead on the road. Don't stop." "Where are you?" "I'm right behind you. Go." She said it the way she'd said everything tonight, without theater, without decoration. The way Ella had learned to recognize meant now, and Ella ran. Vivian ran behind her. She heard commotion behind her. Not gunfire, not yet, something more contained and brutal. And she put herself slightly behind, and to the left of Ella's running body, in case she needed to make herself a barrier, and she kept her eyes on the road ahead, where the scrub was thinning and the smell of salt water was getting stronger. Ella was fast. Vivian had forgotten how fast her daughter moved when she was moving in earnest. Flat-out sprint, arms pumping, that notebook bag bouncing on her back. Behind them, a shout, then another voice cutting it off. Then footsteps, gaining, and Vivian turned her head and saw someone coming out of the scrub to intercept. She didn't think. She turned and put herself directly between that man and Ella, and when he reached for her, she caught his arm, leveraged his forward momentum the way she'd learned to. Not from a class, from a woman she'd waited tables with in Chicago who'd grown up in a rough part of the city and believed in practical knowledge. And he went sideways into the brush with a sound that was satisfying in a way she had no time to examine. She turned back. Ella had stopped 30 feet ahead, looking back with enormous eyes. "I said don't stop," Vivian said, reaching her. "Come on!" She grabbed Ella's hand and they ran. The inlet opened up ahead of them. She could see it, the dark mirror of water, the stone breakwater on 3 sides exactly as Luca had said. 3 men in position, and one of them moved forward when he saw them coming, and Vivian almost stopped before she read his posture and kept running. They reached the breakwater. The man who'd moved forward said something in low, quick Italian, and she didn't understand the words but understood the gesture. Get behind the wall, get down. She got behind the wall. She pulled Ella with her. They crouched in the narrow shelter of stacked stone, and Vivian pulled Ella fully into her lap and wrapped both arms around her and breathed. Just breathed. 8 counts in, 8 out. The old trick. Ella said very quietly, "Your heart is going really fast." "Yeah. Mine too." Vivian pressed her face into Ella's hair for 1 second. 1 second only. Then she straightened up. "Stay here," she said, "behind this wall. Don't come out until I say." "Where are you going?" "To see what's happening. Mom, Ella." She took her daughter's face in both hands. Ella stared at her with those eyes that didn't look away from things. "You trust me?" "Yes." "Then stay here." She came up to the edge of the breakwater. The inlet was a natural amphitheater. Water behind them, stone on three sides. The access road funneling anything approaching into a single entry point. Smart. This was why Luca had wanted this location. The disadvantage was the same as the advantage. One way in meant one way out, and if someone came in behind them, they were boxed. She scanned the approach. Movement at the road mouth. Then Luca, emerging from the dark at a pace just under a run. Marco behind him, favoring his left side. And behind Marco, two of the men she didn't know, moving backward, watching the tree line. Luca reached the breakwater. He came around the stone and his eyes went immediately to Vivian and then to the space beside her, and she saw him register Ella's presence with a physical drop in the tension across his shoulders. "How many came in behind us?" she said. "4. We've slowed them, not stopped." He was breathing hard. The first time she'd seen him breathing hard. It made him look more human and more frightening simultaneously. A cut along his jaw, fresh. He either hadn't noticed it or had filed it under irrelevant. "They'll come through the road mouth in the next few minutes. 4 against 7. 3 on our end are down." He said it without effect. "It's 4 against 4. And they know this terrain better than we thought." The implication sat in the air between them. 4 against 4 with Ella and me as the variable, Vivian said. "Yes." "Then you need to change that variable." She was surprised by her own steadiness. She didn't feel steady. Her hands were shaking, both of them slightly, but her voice wasn't. "Get her out." "Water. Isn't there a boat?" Luca looked toward the inlet. "Small one. Not much. I don't need much. I need it to float and go." She held his gaze. "If this position gets overrun, you need her off the ground. The boat at the dock, whatever boat. You get her in it, and you get her away from the shore. That leaves you exposed." "I'm already exposed." She turned away from him before he could argue it. She went back to Ella. Ella was where she'd left her, back against the inner face of the breakwater wall, notebook bag on her knees. She'd opened the notebook. She was not, as far as Vivian could tell, actually reading it. She was holding it. "Okay," Vivian said. "Here's what's going to happen." Ella looked up. "Luca is going to take you to a boat. You're going to go with him." "What about you?" "I'll be right here." Ella studied her, the 6-year-old assessment, thorough and direct. "Why can't you come on the boat too?" "Because I need to stay here and help." "Help do what?" Vivian paused. "Make sure the people who are coming don't get past this wall." Ella looked at the wall, then at her mother, the dark eyes, completely calm, completely terrifying in their calm. "Okay," Ella said, "but you have to promise." "Promise what?" "That you'll be there when we get back." Vivian looked at her daughter. This small, precise, impossible person. She thought about 6 years of early shifts and evening routines and braids that were slightly uneven and bedtime arguments and hot chocolate at the Harbor Cafe. "I'll be there," she said. She hugged her, fast and hard, both arms locked, her face in Ella's hair for 2 seconds. Then she stood up and called Luca over. He came and Ella went to him. Not immediately, but she went, which was its own kind of miracle. And she looked up at him and said, "You have to make sure she's okay." Luca crouched to her level. The cut on his jaw was already darkening. "She's going to be okay. Promise me." He looked at this child who had his eyes. "I promise you," he said. Ella nodded. She took his hand. He looked up at Vivian once, over Ella's head. She couldn't read the expression. It was too much, too compressed, too many things layered into a single look. And then he stood and he and Ella moved toward the dock, Marco following. Vivian turned to the 2 remaining men at the breakwater. She'd watched them for the last 5 minutes, read their positioning, their communication. One of them, young, compact, moved with the low center of gravity of someone trained to move, glanced at her with an expression that was partly assessing and partly not sure what to do with a woman who hadn't screamed yet. "What's your name?" she said. "Ricci." "Ricci, tell me what we have." He looked at her for 1 more second. Then he told her. They had the breakwater, the single approach road, the water at their backs, and the advantage of elevation on the north side where the stone was stacked 4 feet. They had what Ricci described without flinching as limited resources. How limited, she said. He showed her. She looked at what he showed her and thought about the choices available to a person who has spent 6 years telling themselves they were practical, and she made a decision that the woman she'd been at that bus station at 5 in the morning would not have recognized. Position there, she said, pointing to the high stone. And there, I'll take the road mouth. Ricci stared at her. If they come through the road mouth in the dark, they'll go for the higher ground first. That's you two. I can buy you 30 seconds. She held his eyes. I'm not asking for your permission. A long beat. Ricci nodded. She went to the road mouth. She stood in the gap between the scrub where the access road ended and the open ground of the inlet began, and she waited and she thought about the boat, Ella and Luca on the water, and she thought, 30 seconds is enough. She heard them before she saw them. Footsteps on the access road, more than one set, not trying particularly hard to be quiet because they'd decided they had the numbers and the position, and there was no reason to be quiet when you were certain of the outcome. She pressed herself against the right edge of the gap where the scrub was thickest. The first man came through. She let him take 3 steps past her, then she moved. What she did wasn't elegant. It wasn't the kind of thing she'd call controlled. It was fast and desperate, and it used every pound of her body weight and every ounce of adrenaline that had been building in her bloodstream since Marco said the word contact. And the man went down, and she went with him, and for a moment the world was nothing but gravel and effort, and the sound of the second man coming through the gap too fast to stop. She heard Ricci's voice from the high stone. The second man stopped. The third man, she saw him in her peripheral vision. The third man had a different posture, older, the stillness of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than carrying them out, stood at the road mouth and looked at the situation in front of him and said, in a voice completely without inflection, "Enough." Everything stopped. Vivian was on her knees on the inlet ground. Her palms were bleeding. She'd caught herself on the gravel. Her right shoulder was already informing her it had opinions about the last 60 seconds. The man at the road mouth walked forward 3 steps. He was older, 60 maybe, with the face of someone who had been making difficult decisions for so long that the difficulty had stopped registering. He looked at Vivian on the ground. He looked at Ricci on the stone. He looked at the general geometry of the situation. He said, to the darkness behind him, "Stand down." Vivian stared at him. He looked back at her, the cut on his wrist, the expensive watch above it, the particular combination of violence and bureaucracy that she associated now with a specific world she had spent 6 years trying to believe she'd left. "Mrs. Moretti," he said. The name hit her like cold water. She wasn't Mrs. Moretti. She had never been Mrs. Moretti. But the way he said it, not as a title, as a declaration of significance, as a statement of exactly how much danger that significance placed her in, told her everything she needed to know about what she represented to the man standing at the road mouth with 3 men behind him and a position of complete tactical control. She was not a target. She was leverage. "Where is he?" the man said. She said nothing. "We're not here for you. We're not here for the girl." He said it without any attempt at warmth, which paradoxically made it more believable. "We are here for one conversation with Luca Moretti. You can make that happen without this going any further." She stayed on her knees, bleeding palms, burning shoulder. She looked at this man in the inlet with the dark water behind her and the stone breakwater on 3 sides, and the boat somewhere out there in the dark carrying her daughter away from the shore. She thought, he doesn't know they're on the water yet. She thought, every second I hold this conversation is another second the boat gets further out. She looked up at the man who had called her by a name she'd never claimed. "Tell me your name," she said. He looked at her, reassessing slightly. "Milo Bellanova." The son, not the patriarch. The son. The one Luca had mentioned, the next generation, the inheritor of 11 years of war. She looked at him and she thought about what Luca had said, ending a cycle that has consumed generations. She thought about a 6-year-old girl on a boat in the dark with her notebook in her bag and her father's hands holding the lines. She said, "He'll talk to you?" Milo Bellanova looked at her. "On our terms," she said. "Not yours. He chooses the location and he comes to you unarmed and you come with 1 man. That's it." She held his gaze from her knees, from the gravel, bleeding and burning and completely without room to bluff. You want the conversation? That's the only way it happens. Because the alternative is what's already in motion, and you know how that ends, and so does he, and nobody walks away from it clean. A long silence. The inlet water moved against the stone breakwater, small sounds, patient sounds. Milo Belanova looked at her for a very long time. Then he said, 1 hour. She said, 2. He looked at her. She looked back. 2 hours, he said. Get your men off the access road. He turned, said something. The shapes in the dark behind him shifted and withdrew. Vivian stayed on her knees until the sound of them was gone. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at her hands in the dark. The cuts across both palms, the grit pressed into the skin. She heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Luca was standing at the edge of the breakwater. He had come back, alone, without Ella, which meant Ella was still on the water, and Marco was with her. He had seen at least part of what had just happened. He was looking at her with the expression he'd had when she opened her door that first Tuesday morning, except harder now, more stripped down. The expression of a man confronting something he hadn't calculated for. She's on the water, he said. She's safe. Marco has her. I know. Vivian stood up, slowly. Her shoulder made itself known again, insistently. I bought you 2 hours. I heard. Milo Belanova. He wants a conversation. You and him, one other, location of your choosing. She brushed gravel off her knees because she needed something to do with her hands. He agreed to your terms before he knew he was agreeing to your terms. Luca stared at her. I told him you'd talk, she said. If that was the wrong call, tell me now. A long beat. It wasn't the wrong call, he said quietly. She looked at him across the inlet ground, the dark water behind her, the breakwater stone, the access road cleared and empty. Then make the call, she said. He held her gaze, and for the first time since that first Tuesday morning in her doorway, with 4 words and a cup of coffee he didn't finish, she saw something in his face that was not control and not calculation and not the practiced stillness of a man who had learned to manage every room he entered, something that was simply, plainly, devastatingly human. He looked at the cuts on her hands. He said, Vivian, don't. She said it without hardness. Not yet. Make the call first. He held her gaze 1 more second. Then he raised his phone. He made 3 calls. Vivian sat on the lower edge of the breakwater and listened to the cadence of them without understanding the words. 2 in Italian, 1 in English, all short, all delivered with the same controlled precision she'd come to recognize as his particular dialect of urgency. Not loud. Never loud. Just exact. The way a man speaks when he's learned that volume is for people who haven't yet figured out that the quietest voice in the room is usually the most dangerous one. She turned her hands over in the dark. The cuts across her palms were not deep. Gravel scrapes, the kind that bled more than they should and stung more than they warranted and would be fine by morning. She pressed them against her jeans and felt the pull of it and decided that was sufficient attention for now. Her shoulder was a different conversation. She'd know more about that tomorrow. Luca ended the 3rd call and came to where she was sitting. He didn't sit beside her. He stood, which was how she knew he was still in operational mode. A man in operational mode did not sit down until the situation allowed it. He looked out toward the water where the dark was unbroken and the boat was invisible but present, Marco's voice occasionally carrying faintly across the surface. Milo Belanova won't come in good faith, he said. I know. He'll say yes to your terms and arrive with the intention of changing them when he gets there. I know that too. She looked up at him. But arriving with that intention and following through on it are 2 different things. If he comes to talk, he's already made a calculation. He's decided that the version where you're both still alive at the end of this is more profitable than the alternative. Otherwise, he'd have come in shooting instead of stopping. Luca was quiet for a moment. He stopped because of you, he said. Not because of me. She didn't answer that. What you did at the road mouth. He stopped, tried again. I've dealt with Belanova people for 11 years. They don't stop. Not for an appeal to reason, not for a better offer, not for anything except a calculation of risk. And you changed his calculation in under 3 minutes from your knees on gravel. I told him what he wanted to hear, she said. That you'd talk. You told him the truth. That it was the only way anything ended without destroying everybody. He looked at her. He believed you because you weren't trying to save yourself. She absorbed that, turned it over. Where do you want to meet him? She said. Luca looked back at the water. There's a shipyard south of here, abandoned. I've known about it since I arrived. It was on the list of locations my people mapped when I first got to Seabriar. He paused. It has one entrance, elevated positions on both sides, no civilians. If you know about it, he might know about it. He might. He turned to look at her directly. But he won't know that I know he knows. And that's enough of an edge. She studied him. The cut on his jaw had dried and darkened. The line of it tracked from just below his left cheekbone toward his chin. Not long, but deep enough that it would leave something. She thought abstractly that he was going to carry that scar for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. One condition, she said. Name it. I'm there. He stared at her. Not in the room. I'm not asking to be in the room. She stood up, carefully feeling her shoulder register the movement with a sharp commentary. But I'm there, on site, in a position where I can see what's happening. I am done being the person who waits somewhere and finds out how things turned out. Vivian, that's the condition. She met his gaze. You told me tonight that you made decisions unilaterally that you shouldn't have. This is me doing the opposite of that. This is me telling you up front exactly what I'm going to do. He looked at her for a long time. There's a mezzanine structure on the north side of the main building, he said finally. Steel frame, elevated, sightline over the whole floor. A pause. You stay there and you stay back from the edge. Agreed. And if it goes wrong, I don't need you to tell me what to do. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, closer to the expression of a man who has just recalibrated something fundamental about his understanding of another person. No, he said, I don't suppose you do. He turned toward the water and made a short, low sound, a specific sound, the kind that carries meaning to people trained to receive it. And after a moment, Marco's voice came back across the water, and then the quiet sound of oars. The boat came in slowly. Vivian stood at the edge of the dock and watched it materialize out of the dark, Marco at the stern, and Ella in the bow with her notebook bag on her lap, and her knees pulled up and her eyes tracking the dock until she found her mother. She didn't call out. She sat still in the boat with that particular quality of held-inness that she'd had since the moment Vivian had crouched beside her on the inlet ground and told her to run. And she waited until the boat was close enough, and then she stood up in one motion, and Vivian leaned out and caught her and pulled her in. Ella pressed her face into Vivian's neck. They stood like that on the dock for a moment. Ella's arms were locked around her mother's shoulders, and her feet were dangling slightly because Vivian was holding her up, and neither of them said anything. Your hands are cold, Ella said finally, into Vivian's collar. I know. And your shoulder feels weird. Also correct. A pause. Did you do something scary? Ella asked. A little bit. Ella was quiet for a second. Then, did it work? So far. Ella tightened her arms once, brief and hard, and then she loosened them and leaned back to look at her mother's face in the dark. The dark eyes, steady, examining. 6 years old, sitting in a boat in the middle of the night in a town that had just become complicated. And she had the look of someone who was filing everything away for a conversation they intended to have when the immediate situation resolved. Okay, Ella said. Vivian set her down. They moved within the hour. Ricci and the one other man still standing took point. Luca drove the sedan. Someone had retrieved it from the access road, she didn't ask how, with Vivian beside him and Ella in the back with Marco. Ella fell asleep 10 minutes in, which said everything about the particular resilience of children and nothing reassuring about the night ahead. The shipyard was 20 minutes south. Luca had called Bellanova's man from the inlet with coordinates and a time. 1 a.m. The night had the quality of held breath, the particular dark that came in off the water in the hours before dawn, and the road was empty. Tell me about him, Vivian said. Milo, not his father, him. Luca's eyes stayed on the road. younger than the war. He was 15 when his father and mine started. He grew up inside it the way we all grow up inside the things our parents hand us, not choosing it, just inheriting it. Does he want to end it? He wants to survive it. That's different. A pause. His father is in prison? Has been for 8 months. Milo is running the family on borrowed authority. Half his people take orders because they have to, and the other half are waiting to see if he's strong enough to deserve it. So he's under pressure. Immense. Then he came here to do something that proves he's strong enough. She thought about the man at the road mouth, the voice without inflection, the expensive watch, the calculation in his eyes. Not to kill you, to get something from you, some kind of concession or territory or information he can take back and show as a win. Luca glanced at her. What makes you think that? Because if he wanted you dead, he'd have come with 20 men and he'd have done it quietly. He came with 4, and he stopped when I asked him to. She turned to look at the road. He wanted a stage. A long silence. You're right, Luca said. So give him something. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that the thing he needs most right now is to walk away from this with something his father never managed to get. Not your blood. Something more durable than that. She kept her voice level. What is there that he's wanted from your family for 11 years that wouldn't end your ability to operate? Luca was quiet for a long time. The shipyard appeared in the headlights, chain link and rusted signage, and the dark shapes of industrial buildings against the darker sky. Territory, he said finally. There's a stretch of the northern port district that has been in dispute since the beginning. Commercially valuable, operationally minor to me. My father refused to give it because giving anything was considered weakness. He paused. It's been burning through both families for over a decade, for something that matters less than people on either side are willing to admit. Give it to him, Vivian said. He looked at her. Not because he deserves it, because it costs you less than another decade of this. She held his gaze. Because Ella deserves a father who isn't navigating a war indefinitely, and because you said yourself, ending a cycle is worth more than any individual battle won. He looked back at the road. You said that to me, she said, in the inlet. You said ending the cycle was the point. I said it, he confirmed, quietly. Then mean it. The car stopped at the shipyard gate. Ricci got out and dealt with the chain, and they pulled through, and the headlights swept across a cavernous main building. Corrugated metal, the remnants of industrial equipment, the smell of rust and seawater and old machinery. Vivian turned in her seat. Ella was asleep, genuinely this time, head tilted against the window. Marco met Vivian's eyes over her daughter's sleeping form. She stays in the car, Vivian said. Engine on, keys in. If anything sounds wrong, you drive. Where? Marco said. Away, just away. You'll know the right direction. She looked at him. You're good at this. Marco looked slightly surprised to be addressed directly about it. It's my job. It's more than that, she said. You've been careful with her all night. She paused. Thank you. He didn't say anything, but something in his face shifted, and he nodded once, and that was enough. Yeah. The mezzanine was accessible by an exterior steel staircase on the north face of the building. Ricci took her up and showed her the sight line, and she tested it. Yes, the whole floor was visible, the 2 vehicles, the open central space where the meeting would happen, and 3 exits that she noted without Ricci pointing them out. He looked at her, noting the exits. He said, You've done this before. I've never done anything like this before, she said. But I've spent 6 years watching every room I walked into for the ways out. Turns out that's transferable. She took a position 6 feet back from the mezzanine edge. Enough shadow to be invisible from below, enough angle to see everything. She watched Ricci go back down the stairs. She watched Luca move to the center of the floor and stand there in the industrial dark with his hands loose at his sides, and she thought about the first time she'd seen him. Not through a cracked door, not in a hospital corridor, but before all of it, at an art auction in Chicago on a Wednesday night where she'd gone because a friend had a spare ticket and she'd had nowhere else to be. He'd been standing just like that, in the middle of a room, and she'd thought, that man has never in his life wondered whether he was allowed to take up space. She'd been 28 years old, and she'd found it magnetic in a way that had immediately annoyed her. The sound of vehicles outside. 2 cars. Milo Bellanova had brought 2 cars instead of 1, which was either a violation of the terms or a statement of intent, or both. Luca didn't move. From her position above, she watched the main doors open and watched 3 men walk through. 3, not 2. Also a violation. Milo was in the center. He looked the same as he had at the road mouth. Controlled, well-dressed for the location, the watch catching the ambient light. The 2 men flanking him were built for their function and made no attempt to obscure it. Luca looked at the flanking men. He said, "The terms were 1. Milo looked around the building, taking the measure of it. The terms were suggested by a woman on her knees on gravel. "I'm revising them." "Then we're done here." "No," Milo said. "We're not." He took 3 steps forward. His men stayed put, which was its own form of communication. He wasn't afraid to close the distance. "We're done being afraid of each other. Or you are. I was never afraid of you specifically, Moretti. I was afraid of the precedent." He stopped 10 feet from Luca. "My father spent 11 years teaching me that the only language your family understood was force, that anything short of it was surrender." Luca said nothing, waiting. "He was wrong," Milo said. It came out flat, slightly bitter, the tone of a man admitting something costly. "Or he was right for his time, and his time is done. I'm not sure which." He looked at Luca directly. "My father is in a federal facility serving 18 years. Half my people are watching to see if I fall over. The other half are the ones who'll push me if I don't." He paused. "I came here with 3 men because I can't afford to look like I came alone. That's the reality." Vivian exhaled slowly through her nose. Up above, in the dark, she watched. Luca took 1 step forward, closing the gap slightly. "What do you want?" "What my father couldn't get. Direct, no theater. The Northern Port District, full commercial rights, no interference. In exchange for this ending tonight." Milo's jaw set. "For my people standing down. For the contract on your family being dissolved. For 11 years of this being finished." He held Luca's gaze. "I don't want to be my father. I don't want to spend my life running a war that started before I was old enough to understand what it was about. I want something to build on." The building was very quiet. Vivian could hear her own breathing. She could hear the distant sound of water moving against whatever dock or shore existed beyond the back wall of the building. She could hear the particular quality of a silence in which 2 men were deciding what kind of people they intended to be from this moment forward. Luca said, "The Northern Port District." "Yes. You get commercial rights. Exclusively. No operational infrastructure. I find 1 weapons cache or 1 trafficking route running through that district with your name on it, and the deal dissolves." Milo's eyes narrowed slightly. "Agreed. And you come back for Ricci and the men you took down tonight." A pause. "They're alive." "I know. You come back for them." "That can be arranged." Milo looked at him. "Is that it?" "One more thing." Luca reached into his jacket. Milo's men shifted, both of them, forward by half a step, and Luca paused, waited until they settled, and then produced a folded piece of paper. He extended it. Milo looked at it, didn't take it. "What is that?" "The name of the federal prosecutor building the case against your father, and the name of 2 witnesses in that case who have been inconsistent in their previous testimony." He left the paper extended. "Make of it what you will." Milo stared at him. "I've had it for 4 months, Luca said. "I was saving it for a different conversation. Consider it a gesture of good faith in this one." A long moment. Milo reached out and took the paper. He looked at it, folded it, put it in his jacket. He extended his hand. Luca looked at it. Just for a second. The hesitation of a man who had spent his entire adult life learning not to trust extended hands. Then he took it. They shook once, brief, without warmth, but without hostility. The handshake of men who have run out of the energy to hate each other and have found that exhaustion, properly applied, can do the work that reason couldn't. Milo turned. His men fell in behind him. At the main doors, he stopped and looked back. "The woman at the road mouth," he said. "Who is she?" Luca looked at him. "The mother of my daughter." Milo absorbed this. Something moved in his face. Not quite respect, not quite recognition, but something in that neighborhood. "She should have been a general," he said. Then he left. The building doors swung shut behind them. Vivian stayed on the mezzanine for a full minute after she heard the cars leave. She needed the minute. She needed to sit on the steel grating with her back against a support beam and her knees pulled up and let the night settle out of her body. The adrenaline, the fear, the 6 hours of operating at a register she hadn't known she could sustain. Her palms hurt. Her shoulder was now lodging a formal complaint. She got up. She went down the stairs. Luca was still standing in the center of the floor when she reached the bottom. He was looking at the doors where Milo Bellanova had walked out. He turned when he heard her footsteps. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "The Northern Port District," she said. "Yes." "Is it really operationally minor?" He looked at her. "It generates about 4% of total revenue. The dispute has cost both families considerably more than that over 11 years in money, time, and people." He paused. "So, yes. And the prosecutor information. Real. I checked it 3 times before I brought it. You were already planning this." He was quiet for a second. "I was planning for the possibility of a conversation that was worth having. The way you plan for things, you don't know if you'll get." She looked at him across the industrial floor, the cut on his jaw, the gray sweater that had started the evening clean, the hands that she had watched extend a piece of paper toward a man who had come here to end his family's bloodline. "You chose not to execute him," she said. "Milo, when you had 3 men and the position and the night, you had options. I had one option that ended this. The others just continued it." She thought about that. She thought about 11 years. She thought about a man doing 18 years in federal prison for a war that had outlived its own reasons. "Your father," she said. "Would he have made the same call?" Luca's face did something complicated. "No." "Why not?" "Because he believed that the only victory worth having was a total one. That compromise was another word for the beginning of the next conflict." He looked at the floor. "He wasn't wrong about that exactly, but he also never—" He stopped. "What?" He looked up. "He never had anything outside the war that he valued more than winning it. So the calculation was always the same, every time." She stood in the shipyard in the hour before dawn with the smell of rust and salt and the sound of water through the walls, and she thought about the calculation, about what changed it, about a 6-year-old girl asleep in the back of a car with a stuffed rabbit and a notebook, and the patient certainty of someone who had been told that the person who loved her was going to be there when she got back. "What happens now?" Vivian said. Luca looked at her. "With Bellanova?" "With everything." He took a breath. Let it out. "Bellanova is done, if he holds to it. I believe he will. He's got more to gain from stability than from another decade of this." He looked at his hands, then back up at her. "As for the rest, I've been doing something for the last 14 months, quietly. Before I found you, before I knew about Ella, before any of this." He paused. "I've been moving money, restructuring, the legitimate side of the business, the real estate, the import brokerage, the restaurant group. They can stand alone. They've been able to stand alone for years. I was just never willing to let them." She looked at him. "I'm done," he said simply. "With the rest of it. It's not a decision I made tonight. It's a decision I made over 14 months, and tonight is just the last weight off the scale." He held her gaze. "I want to be in Ella's life. That's not possible if I stay in this world. So I'm leaving it." She absorbed this. "People don't just leave that world," she said. "No, but they do restructure it, divest, sever ties, make themselves ordinary enough that there's no longer a reason for anyone to look twice." He said it practically, without grandeur. "It takes time, it takes the right sequence, but it's done, or close enough to done that what's left is paperwork." She was quiet for a moment. You're telling me this now. I'm telling you this now because it's true now, and because you asked, and because... He stopped. Because you were on your knees on gravel tonight buying me time. You deserve to know what you bought it for. She stood very still. Her hands hurt. Her shoulder ached with a dull specificity. She thought about everything she'd built in Seabriar on the premise that she could create safety by choosing distance. The apartment above the harbor, the cafe shifts, the braids that were never quite even. The life that was good and real and genuinely hers, and also lonely in a way she had learned to manage by keeping busy and had never fully managed at all. She thought about Ella's face in the cafe 2 days ago, looking at Luca across the table and saying, "You have the same eyes as me," with the calm of someone reporting an observation. "You said you'd become the father she deserves," Vivian said. "One ordinary day at a time." "I said that. I want to know what that looks like, specifically." He looked at her. "What does it need to look like?" "I'm not giving you the answer to that question. You tell me." He was quiet for a moment, not stalling, thinking, the way he thought about things he wanted to get right. "It looks like being here," he said finally. "In Seabriar, or wherever you need it to be. It looks like school pickups and the snail notebook and whatever experiment she has going on at any given moment." He paused. "It looks like being someone she can introduce to people without a cover story." "And me?" He held her gaze. "That's your call, entirely. Whatever you need that to be. Co-parents, people who share custody and nothing more, I'll make that work. I'm not here to ask you for more than you can give." She stared at him across the shipyard floor. "I was wrong," she said. He waited. 6 years ago. Not about leaving. I don't know that I was wrong about leaving, but about the way I left, about not asking the question. She felt the words cost her something as she said them. "I had 10 hours, and I didn't use them. I decided I already knew the answer, and I built a life on top of that decision." "Vivian, let me finish." She took a breath. "I'm not asking for your absolution for it. I'm just saying it out loud because I've been carrying it since you sat in my kitchen and told me about the 10 hours, and I need to put it down somewhere." She looked at him. "I'm putting it down." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully catalog. Too much in it. "I left you," she said, "at one of the most dangerous moments in your life, carrying your child, without a word. And you spent 14 months restructuring your entire existence, and then you came to my door and knocked and waited, and didn't ask me for an explanation." She held his gaze. "Why?" He didn't look away. "Because you didn't owe me one." She stared at him. "You made the decision you made with the information you had," he said. "The information was wrong, but it was what you had. You were protecting her." He said it quietly, without martyrdom, just as a thing that was true. "I don't spend much time being angry at people for trying to protect the people they love." The building was very quiet. Outside, beyond the walls, the first birds were beginning. That earliest pre-dawn sound, tentative and thin. The sound that always arrived before the light did. She walked toward him, not fast, not with drama. Just closed the distance between them on an industrial floor at the edge of morning, and when she was close enough, she put one hand, the cut palm, she realized too late, which made it awkward and slightly painful, against the left side of his jaw, avoiding the cut. He went very still. "I don't know what this is yet," she said. "I want to be honest about that." "Okay. I know she needs you, I know that." She held his gaze from 6 inches away. "And I know, after tonight, after the way tonight went, that you're not the man I built in my head over 6 years. You might be worse in some ways and better in others, and I don't know yet. And I need time to know." "You can have it." "I'm not finished." She kept her hand where it was. "I also know that the person I was at the bus station at 5 in the morning was someone who made herself entirely alone because she thought that was the same as being safe. And I've spent 6 years being very, very safe and very... She stopped. "Alone," she said. "Very alone." Something in his face broke open, just slightly, just enough. "I'm not asking for anything tonight," she said. "But I'm not closing the door either." He covered her hand with his. Gently, the way you hold something you know is fragile and warm and real. "Okay," he said. His voice had gone rough. "Okay." They stood like that in the shipyard for a moment, the birds outside getting louder. Then she dropped her hand and stepped back and said, "Let's go get our daughter." So, Ella woke up when the car door opened. She surfaced from sleep with her usual speed and looked at her mother getting into the passenger seat and then at Luca getting behind the wheel, and she registered with 6-year-old accuracy that the temperature of the air in the car had changed. "Is it done?" she said. "It's done," Vivian said. Ella nodded. She looked out the window. Dawn was beginning, just a gray-blue loosening of the dark at the horizon, the first suggestion of color over the water. "I'm hungry," Ella said. Luca made a sound that was almost a laugh. It came out slightly broken, slightly surprised, like a laugh that had been waiting a long time and finally found the exit. "We'll find somewhere," he said. They found a diner 12 miles north that was open at 5:30 for the fishermen and the early risers. A corner booth, Formica table, a coffee pot that the waitress kept circling back to refill. Ella ordered pancakes and ate most of them and did not spill anything, which she mentioned unprompted as a significant achievement. She sat between Vivian and Luca in the booth, which she had arranged herself, shifting down the seat without announcement until she was in the middle. She kept her notebook out on the table and made several entries while waiting for the food, which she did not explain and which neither adult asked about. After the food arrived, she said, without looking up from the notebook, "Are you going to stay?" The question was aimed at Luca. He looked at her, and then at Vivian, and Vivian made a small movement with her eyes that meant this one is yours. He looked back at Ella. "Yeah," he said. "I'm going to stay." Ella made one more entry in the notebook. Then she closed it. "Good," she said, and picked up her fork. "Best I 3 weeks later, the apartment above the harbor had too much furniture. Not badly, just the particular fullness of a space that had been configured for 2 people and was now accommodating 3, and the accumulated belongings of a man who had, it turned out, very few belongings in the way of things that mattered, and considerably more in the way of books, which Ella had immediately catalogued and organized by a system she refused to explain. Luca slept on the couch for the first week. His idea, not Vivian's, he'd said, practically, that the arrangement needed to make sense to Ella before it needed to make sense to anyone else, and she'd agreed, and she'd also noticed that he'd said it without any of the strategic patience she'd initially suspected him of deploying, and with something that looked more like actual consideration. The second week he found a small rental 3 streets over. Close enough to walk in 5 minutes, far enough that it wasn't a thing Vivian had to feel a position about. Ella visited it on the 4th day and declared it acceptable, but noted that it lacked plants, which she considered a correctable problem. She arrived the following afternoon with a small succulent from Mrs. Calloway's windowsill that she'd been given permission to take and installed it on Luca's kitchen windowsill with the authority of someone completing a necessary task. "Now it's better," she said. Luca looked at the succulent. "Thank you," he said. "You have to water it," Ella said, "but not too much. They don't like too much." "How much is too much?" Ella looked at him with patient exasperation. "I'll write it down for you." She did. In the notebook, carefully, with a small labeled diagram. She tore the page out and left it on his counter. He kept it there. Vivian saw it when she came to pick up Ella one evening, 3 weeks in, and found them at his kitchen table with the notebook open between them, Ella explaining something about gastropod nervous systems with intensity, and Luca listening with his full attention in that way he had, elbows on the table, eyes on her daughter's face. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Neither of them had heard her come in. She watched Ella's hands move while she talked, expressive, emphatic, slightly dramatic. Luca's expression, attentive and genuinely interested, asking a clarifying question that made Ella point at something in the notebook and say exactly, "That's exactly it." The same eyes looking at each other. She didn't announce herself. She just stood in the doorway and let it be what it was. The Bellanova agreement held. Luca heard from his people in Chicago 6 days after the shipyard meeting. Quiet confirmation through the appropriate channels that Milo Bellanova had pulled his operation back from the northern corridors, dissolved the contract, and done so with enough finality that the men in his organization who'd been watching for weakness read it as strength instead. Ricci returned with the men who'd been taken down at the inlet. All of them were whole, which was either a concession or a message or both. Luca spent the following weeks in a series of phone calls and meetings she wasn't part of. He didn't hide them from her. He told her simply when there was something to tell, the way one adult tells another adult about the work they're doing. She appreciated the simplicity of it. 2 months after the shipyard, he flew back to Chicago for a week. He told Ella he was going before he went, which Vivian hadn't asked him to do but noticed. Ella said, "When are you coming back, Shay?" He said, "Sunday." She accepted this. He came back on Sunday. Vivian asked, when Ella was in bed, "How did it go?" He said, "The real estate holdings are fully separated. The import brokerage will take another 2 months. The restaurant group is already clean." He looked at his hands. "My underboss of 11 years thinks I've lost my mind." "What did you tell him?" "That he was welcome to think so." A pause. "He'll run what's left of the operation. It's smaller now, more contained. Nothing I need to be part of to keep moving." He looked up. "In 6 months, I'll be someone a background check finds very boring." She sat across from him at the kitchen table, her kitchen table, the one with the cracked leg she'd propped with a folded magazine for 2 years. "Is that what you want?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've spent my whole life inside something my father built. I don't know what I want outside of it yet." He was honest about it, no pretense. "But I know what I don't want." "What?" "Ella asking where I am and not knowing the answer. That's the thing I don't want." She looked at him. She said, "You should get a plant for your living room too. Ella's going to keep escalating." He looked at her, the almost laugh again, slightly surprised each time. "What kind?" "Something harder to kill than a succulent. Give yourself a learning curve." He was smiling. She noticed it the way she noticed things she'd decided not to examine too closely. Present, registered, filed away. She stood up to go put the kettle on. He said, behind her, "Vivian?" She turned. He was looking at her across the kitchen, just looking. Nothing staged about it. "Thank you," he said, "for opening the door." She stood at the kitchen counter and thought about a door she'd stood behind with her forehead pressed against it, listening to footsteps go down the stairs, the building door open and close. The door she'd turned around and put her hand on the knob of. "You would have knocked again," she said. "Every day." She turned and filled the kettle. "I know," she said. The morning she thought of, later, as the morning everything finally landed, not the shipyard, not the first night, not even the harbor cafe, was an ordinary Saturday in late autumn. The herbs on the windowsill had been repotted. She'd done it 2 weeks earlier, a Sunday project, while Ella supervised and Luca sat at the kitchen table making the calls he still had to make. And the kitchen had smelled like rosemary and potting soil, and it had been mundane in a way she'd wanted badly, and hadn't known she'd wanted until she had it. Ella had gone down to the harbor with a jar and a plan. Something about tidal patterns, something about which rocks the small crabs preferred. Luca had gone with her, which had become a Saturday morning arrangement. Not by discussion, just by accumulation, the way things become arrangements when the people involved keep choosing them. Vivian was at the kitchen window with coffee when she saw them on the harbor path below. Ella was walking fast, the way she always walked when she had a purpose, notebook under one arm. Luca was keeping pace beside her, hands in his jacket pockets, listening to whatever she was saying. She looked up at him mid-sentence and made a gesture with the hand that wasn't holding the notebook, an emphatic explanatory gesture, the kind she used when the point was important. And he nodded and said something back, and Ella laughed. Not the polite laugh she used with adults she was still assessing. The full one. The one that was also slightly too loud and came from somewhere undefended. Vivian stood at the window with both hands around her coffee cup and watched them go down the path toward the harbor. She thought about a bus station at 5 in the morning, a name on the inside of her wrist, the specific quality of the dark at that hour, before dawn, before any of it. She thought about a woman who had told herself that running was the same as protecting. She thought about a woman who had learned, slowly and expensively, and through exactly the kind of suffering that does not sanitize itself into wisdom, but just remains stubbornly suffering. That protection was not a place you ran to, it was something you stayed to provide. She went outside. She caught up with them on the harbor path, pulling on her jacket, coffee abandoned on the counter. Ella heard her footsteps and looked back without breaking stride. "You're coming?" Ella said. "I'm coming." Ella faced forward again with the satisfaction of someone whose plan has expanded in the right direction. She reached out her free hand without looking. Vivian took it. On Ella's other side, Luca glanced at Vivian over their daughter's head. The autumn light on the water, the sound of gulls. His face older than the one she'd loved first, and carrying everything the years had put in it. The weight of the choices, the scar along his jaw now faded but permanent, the lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the harbor, and the three of them walked. Ella talked about crabs the entire way, and nobody asked her to stop, and the morning light came off the water at an angle that was very particular to that coast, that season, that town she had built a life in from almost nothing. The door to tomorrow, Vivian thought, was not something you found at the end of the running. It was something you walked through when you finally stopped. And this, the rocky harbor path, the cold, salt air, the small, warm hand in hers, the man walking beside her carrying a life he was still learning to put down. This was what it looked like on the other side. Not perfect, not without cost, but open, wide open, and lit by ordinary morning and entirely, improbably, hers.